Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I've been asked to introduce Dada, but I'm not very good at these things, so I would just like to say thank you for coming. And I'm incredibly interested in this, in these ideas about an alternative economy, because I think that this is the future. And I've been researching this a little bit, and so I'm very excited to hear what this is about, what your ideas and concepts about the future economy are. I'm also interested because I think this will be the next project of the Pirate Party to really think about the economy of the future. You know, what direction we're moving in. And it's interesting because we now have, in Parliament, we have probably a new committee that's being set up, which is going to be the Future Committee. And there, the idea is to really put a focus on, you know, what is coming in a future society and how we can prepare for that. And I think that this could be a part of that. So, thank you very much for coming. Even if it's not very many people here, this will be recorded and streamed, and we'll at least have it. Thank you.
Well, we brought something for you also. I would like to present to you personally and to the pirates in your headquarters here, and the book, Growing a New Economy.
Fantastic.
By Roger from Early Harvard.
Yeah.
So I'll just explain maybe at the beginning a little bit about the book and how it's structured.
Okay.
And we can recommend one of our colleagues and friends and a strong representative of PROUT also, who's a UNESCO fellow and world sought futurist. Come as a consultant for you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
So what I will share this evening is not directly about the book, so I'd like to start with explaining a little, because the book is very important for us, and we feel for everyone. So it's called Growing a New Economy, and moving beyond the destructive capitalism and environmental destruction. And it's structured in a very particular way. It begins with an analysis of the current situation on our planet, and it speaks about 4 different and interwoven crises that we face. The financial crisis, the crisis of inequality. Am I speaking loud enough?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. There was a and natural resources crisis, and then the environmental crisis as a whole. So it addresses each of these, and then also speaks of how they're interwoven into what we call a perfect storm situation. Then there's a historical section on the development of capitalism itself, from its earliest days as mercantilism and up to what it's become today in the world with corporate capitalism. Then a section follows that on how different forms of capitalism, how it's trying to morph in the modern day, and a comment and a critique of those, for example, so-called green capitalism, and why it's also not really a proper enough solution. Okay, thank you very much.
I'll be back.
Then there's a section that gives recommendations for what could be done under the current system, reforms that could be enacted based on certain principles and policies that would improve the situation, and addressing each of those different crises, and also the basic economic flaws, but why those reforms don't go far enough, what's needed is a whole new system. Then the following sections actually introduce a little bit, or much more actually, than what I'm going to share a little bit with you tonight about. So, okay, we're right up already. And I thought to begin with just a few minutes about a little my own journey. So, you may know from the way I speak, we haven't introduced each other yet, that from the USA. And I grew up in the late 60s and early 70s. So it was a very particular time in many parts of the world, particularly in Western countries, of cultural upheaval. And so I grew up when I was about 14 years old, I think I went on my first protest. And Vietnam, it was a war moratorium, but Vietnam had already wound down, but we were still in Cambodia. So there I was on the streets with friends and maybe my older sister participating in that. And then I also remember I was, I think, the organizer in my hometown for the very first Earth Day. So from relatively early in my life, in my adolescence, I got involved in social issues and with a mindset for social change. I became very interested in different, at that time, again in the mid-70s, there were many things being published and written about alternatives in technology, in education, in lifestyles, of course. So, and I was very enthusiastic in looking into all of these. And one thing very much inspired me was the work of a great man. You may know about Buckminster Fuller. Many people know about the geodesic domes that are used. They cover swimming pools and gardens and etc. By the way, he also did meditation. And I can remember very clearly, well, the university I wound up going to, he actually founded a faculty there in what he called anticipatory design science. But one of the activities he used to engage in, he called the world game, where he would engage professors, teachers, graduate students, and undergraduate students in a week-long intensive research and work effort. And so this is, 73, 74, 75, and I remember very clearly back then, they had come up one year, they focused on world hunger. And their answer, is we can solve. Nobody has to go hungry on this planet. Then maybe the following year was about energy. And back then, they declared that without any fossil fuels, the entire planet could enjoy the standard of living that at that time America, Germany, and Japan enjoyed, only with renewable energies. And so these kind of ideas were very much inspiring me. So I was, like many people in that time, very idealistic and very hopeful and full of activism. I think, in fact, that in the last several years, we've seen a rebirth of activism, unlike since back then. And I can remember, was it 2 years ago? When I heard the news that and saw the photos on TV, I think that 2,000 or 3,000 people were in the square outside Parliament here in Reykjavik, calling for the Parliament, or at least the Prime Minister, to step aside. So it was a time of, like I said, ideals, and it formed a certain values set. And that's what I wanted to highlight. Because I think, like the pirates also, you have a very strong stand on certain values. And what we were talking about just a little bit earlier, when you said, Haldar, about the old having to make room for the new. Mm-hmm. And really, what is that about? We'll talk about some systems change and structural changes and all that, but what underlies that is about the values of life that we hold important. So there was a quote I came across many, many years ago that inspired me also. Maybe you've seen it before. And do you know who said it? I purposely left the name off of this, whoever spoke or wrote this. Easy?
No, I've never seen it before.
It's a famous Cuban guy.
Mm-hmm. Che Guevara.
Ah.
One of many inspiring quotes by him. So, and it's interesting the way he says, at the risk of seeming ridiculous. But, so, some years later, after I had become introduced to PROUT, another quote came that I found equally and more so inspiring. It relates to the presentation. So. P.R. Sarkar, Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, is the founder of PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory. So, and unlike perhaps all other ideas, though PROUT has many other aspects, and we'll touch upon them maybe just in a very brief way. Tonight will be also brief, but about the economic system or economic policies and principles that PROUT proposes. But there's a values base to it, unlike most others. So, now, a friend came up with a clever title for what could be tonight's presentation. So I thought just to share it. In fact, it's this gentleman right here. So, and it's very appropriate. And though I know very little about Iceland, and I hope we'll discuss more and I'll learn more, but at the very heart of what PROUT proposes as an economic system is local self-reliance. A decentralized, democratized, locally, regionally self-reliant economy. So we'll talk more about that, perhaps how it applies to Iceland. Okay, so you've probably read the little introductory note that I sent as a proposal for this evening's program. And in that, said very clearly also that there are many people who have very succinctly, very clearly, very deeply analyzed and present what's wrong with the system that we have now. There are much fewer people who write about what to do instead, what can replace that. But there are inspiring examples. There are great people with great ideas and great practical works going on all over the world. So, for example, in the second paragraph, people were quite networked and connected with this movement in Denmark particularly, and in Europe in general, people who are doing eco-villages, or the permaculture movement, people who set up different types of sustainable communities or models for that. Great ideals, great works, but they're isolated events in many ways, though they are networking more and more. But there's not a cohesive, systemic strength that challenges the status quo as it is in the world today. So, as we see in the last one, that much fewer people are conceiving and beginning to try to practice what would actually be a systemic change, a new model, a new system. Naomi Klein and her colleagues have published something from Canada, what they call the LEAP program. Okay, and it's got really good fundamentals and very clear. But again, it doesn't go into very much detail. It's quite generalized, but it's a step in the right direction. A great thinker and doer in the USA, Gar Alperit, has a project called the New Systems Project, and different forms of what they call more participatory democracy. Again, really, really good and important work.
What's it called?
The New System Project. New Systems. Okay, so just a few details about PROUT itself. It was first introduced and articulated in 1959 by Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, or P.R. Sarkar. And I mentioned earlier about it having a values base. We can say more clearly it has a very holistic view of life, and one that embraces all the different aspects of the human life. So not only the material and the physical, the intellectual and creative, emotional, but also that we have a spiritual dimension to our beings. There's an analysis or an analogy of moving like a family, or like a group of people traveling together somewhere. If one member of that family or one member of that party is lagging behind, the whole group may stop to make sure that they can come along with them in an ideal, in a functional family. There's a lot of dysfunctional family in the world today, but in an ideal and functional family, that's the way you live. A family makes sure that all of its members are taken care of. So some people say, is there an example of PROUT in practice in the world today? Can I see PROUT practiced anywhere? And you say, well, if there's an ideal family, that could be a very micro level example. Everyone's taking proper care of. We are going to focus on the economic aspect tonight, and again, just a very introductory look at it, but PROUT is much larger than that. There's a system or a theory of class, an analysis of how different social or psychological classes, not just economic classes, how they move throughout history, something called the social cycle. There's concepts for government, for improving upon democracy, a vision for a world government, how that could be composed, and different social aspects, and then also the economic aspect. I was mentioning just to somebody a little while ago, I just got news today, if anyone might be familiar with the Schumacher Institute in Wales. We've heard of E.F. Schumacher. He was a quite known economist, British economist in the 70s. He had a famous book called Small is Beautiful, and talked about more ecologically based and smaller scale decentralized economics. There's an institute based on his work in Wales, and they are one of the oldest and well-established models of a model demonstration center for sustainable technology, renewables, et cetera, et cetera. So they've just recently, somebody who read the book, Growing a New Economy, and contacted Roar, one of the authors, and wants to have a dialogue about different issues. So more and more people are coming to know about it. We won't go into detail with what I'll share tonight, but the points that I'm going to share are, if we want to, are analyzed according to each of these 4 criteria that, again, define a values base and practical base for somehow measuring the value, the worthiness of these ideas, of the PROUT's principles and policies. So an ideal society and economy would foster social harmony and unity. We have a concept of maximum utilization with also a proper distribution. So utilizing all the different potentialities and resources of both nature and humanity. So meeting people with minimum resources, having something that's ecologically balanced and sustainable. And, as I mentioned already, that gives full expression to all the different aspects of our being. Okay, so a very fundamental concept in PROUT is that everyone in society should be guaranteed the basic necessities of life. In Scandinavia, this isn't much of an issue. But, but when you've been in Africa and in Asia and Latin America, you see, and we forget often how the majority of people in the planet live. But this is not the concept of UBI, of universal basic income. Our approach is different to it. So through different types of guarantees, and PROUT recommends constitutionally based guarantees. So the provision of basic necessities would be done through a mechanism that, 1, guarantees full employment. That everyone who's fit, healthy enough, and capable of doing some kind of work would have a work to do, and guaranteed purchasing capacity. That what they earn from that work is enough to provide themselves with the basic necessities. So there's a concept there of guarantees that allow us to provide the basic necessities of life. The basis of that, of course, is that if okay, I know the pirates put tremendous value or importance, the little bit that I've studied about you, on the individual, on the rights of the individual. We'd say that there needs to be a balance between the rights of the individual together with the rights of the society, or the contribution to the society. So when I talked about work, that everyone would have a job or work, that could be humanitarian work, ecological work, helping to green the economy, helping to take care of children or elderly or whatever. So then excuse me.
Like a glass of
Some
water?
water?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Easy.
Although it's okay.
Oh, you found some. Oh, here, this is a big glass. Yeah. Oh, you prefer the one warm. Yeah.
So one of the basic concepts is that there should always be an increase, rising and an increase in the standard of living. And the mechanism for that would be that if everyone is provided the basic necessities of life, but there are incentives given to people who give a greater contribution to society, so that it becomes like the next threshold. And then that everyone else would be raised up to that level of what the higher level for the incentives would be, then another threshold created for the incentives. And not always, in fact, not recommended usually as financial incentives, but other things that help people to do whatever they contribute to society in a better way. And that there must be limits on accumulation of wealth. For the individuals, for families, for companies, or cooperatives, whatever form of collective endeavors are there. There would be limits on accumulation of wealth. So we talk very much in the world about minimum wages, but there would be a concept of a maximum wage as well. And we think that this is totally antithetical to most thinking in the world today. It's interesting, I found out only fairly recently, there's actually a historical precedent for this in, of all places, the USA. In the mid-40s, I think it was in 1944, the US actually implemented a limit on salaries, on income. And the way they did it was, and the proposal was that 25,000 US dollars would be the maximum anyone could earn. And at that time, $25,000 was the value of something like $400,000 today. And anything above that would be taxed 100%. It went to Congress, and there was a very lively, to use a nice word, lively debate on it, and it passed at 93%. So, a little known historical fact maybe, but
how long was that? Did it go on for?
I'm not sure, but
no.
not very long because of,
until the 70s they had taxes up to at least 70% on super riches.
yeah,
Then they ruled it again.
before Reagan and Thatcher came into play. Yeah. So there have been historical precedents for it, you know, and in all places. So it's an idea that is not talked about very much in of course, communism, it doesn't exist for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist in the world anymore today. When it did, it had an ideal that there was no private property or no accumulation of, and of course that didn't work, either in theory or in reality. And in the rest of the world and in capitalism, there's unlimited accumulation permitted. But in PROUT, there's accumulation, but there must be a limit.
Can I ask that when you say accumulation, is it just wages, or do you mean also property?
Yes,
yeah.
Also property.
So
yes.
it's like
wealth, not only income, but on wealth.
So maximum property or maximum
also.
Yeah.
And that would be determined by society. How? Those things are for us to work out in practice. And it may change, it may vary from place to place, from time to time. The amounts would vary, certainly from time to time, and also what's appropriate in Iceland is not the same as what's appropriate in West Africa, where I spent many years. So it's something that always has to be adjusted according to the situation. So this is a graphic representation of how this dynamic would work towards reducing and eventually resolving inequality. That the downward pressure and the upward pressure from these two different policies and principles interplay. The effect of it would be that they minimize inequality. So the macroeconomic system, you say, of PROUT has two main components. So the first is what we call the three-tier economy. This is that there are, and then self-reliant regions. So regarding the three-tiered economy, small-scale, privately owned enterprises. Small scale meaning very few people working there and producing non-essential goods. So private ownership, but in a limited way. That the vast majority of economic activity, both industrial and agricultural, and also commercial of all types, would be done through cooperatives, worker-owned and worker-managed cooperatives. So this would be the bulk of the economy and the direct expression of economic democracy. So this would be, they would be responsible for producing all forms of basic necessities of life. Everything dealing with food, and clothing, housing, etc., etc. Also banking. And then not state-owned or nationally owned key industries, but locally owned. Iceland's a bit unique perhaps because of the size of the population and the country itself, but even here you have distinct regions. So that key industries, mining and transport, etc., would be, it's recommended they would be owned by, and power generation, owned by local governments, or could function to some extent like public utilities in the USA, but autonomous from the government itself. So these three levels of economic activity. And this really becomes, in many ways, the heart of the PROUTist economy, that there's great decentralization of locally regional self-reliance. As much as possible, areas with, it will vary again from place to place, but say approximately 100,000 people should be, as far as possible, be able to produce the basic necessities of life for the people who live in that area. So now again, I'll be interested to dialogue with you about what that would mean for a place like Iceland. Of course, with the climate the way it is, and the terrain, the geography, so that, but still with technological innovation, so much food could be produced here locally, etc. So that economic planning is done by local people. So, for example, right now we're in, when I'm in Portugal, we are involved with a municipal authority there in a fairly small city. They are working on, and it's a European-wide program, I understand. So they're trying to get the local farmers to provide the fresh produce for the schools in their municipality. There's one very practical example. Rather than having it imported from even other parts of Portugal, which is a relatively small country, or other parts of the EU. But that they bring together stakeholders from different parts of that district, essentially, or municipality, and do the planning together. They know the local resources, they know the local needs, the local situation. And Scandinavia is a good example of being able to integrate into a larger area. Some of our people have a concept they're beginning to work on of the Nordic Alliance. Maybe much more appropriate, perhaps, for the continent, for the Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, but Iceland, by history and language, etc., would be attached as well. So that, for example, Denmark and the south of Sweden is the breadbasket of all the Nordic countries, and could be for much more. So we've seen already we didn't speak in any detail, but we know very well what the defects are of the current system. And that these different initiatives that we said that have great promise and great positivity have something so much to contribute, but it's not a strong enough force to stand up to the system that exists today. Some few examples of the work that we are doing as a movement around the world. And the books, we happen to have all of these books with us tonight, for those of you who are here. So, we have, in different places throughout the world and in Europe, in Portugal, also in Denmark, we have cooperative communities. So people who are trying to give a model, example, of living together in a more sustainable way, and combine that with different advocacy work or educational work, teaching, seminars, retreats, etc. In Denmark, we have a farm in a town called Vig, a little more than an hour from Copenhagen, where there's an organic garden and a bakery, training center, volunteers. We have a PROUT-based political party that's been active for the last few years in Germany. It's called Menschliche Welt, which means human or humane world. They've contested in both state and just last October in national elections. And they're quite new, but they garnered still, I think it was something like 11,000 votes, which for a very new party, competing for the first time in the national level. So they have a ways to go, but they're working on it. And they do have leadership training programs regularly throughout the year. In the Philippines, and quite a bit of activity going on there, actually, and in different developing countries. We are working hand in hand with 3 municipal governments in different regions of the Philippines, helping with poverty reduction, helping to start cooperatives, grow more food locally in all three of these areas. They have populations vary from 20,000 up to about 100,000 in each of the area on its own. And almost all of them import anywhere from 40 to 100% of the food that the people are eating in the town. So to help start growing more food and also develop local industries, whether processing coconut, which many grow all over the Philippines, or more rice, sugar, but to help value-added cottage industries making products from them as well. Also the idea that's being used in some European cities about using anchor institutions as a way of developing local economic money circulation within the local economy. You may know, if you've heard about what's going on in Preston, UK, or in Cleveland, Ohio, where, for example, a university or a hospital, what they call an anchor institution, and they make contracts to be supplied by local businesses with a preference on cooperatives, so that money starts to be kept within that city, within the local economy. So similar idea with some of these municipalities, and also a buy local campaign, as well as leadership training. So model farms, and in one of the cities they've started what they call backyard gardens. They have 250 households who have already started backyard gardens, organic gardens, to help increase the food supply and also feed their own families. There's also a nationwide movement. It's an alliance of different regional movements. In the Philippines, there's many different, actually, dialects and languages on the different islands, and people have their own particular cultural expressions. And you know, the name Philippines is a colonial name. The name of their country was Maharlika. Maharlika means great, small but great. So and actually the current president, Duterte, he also, and even Marcos, even Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator from before, they've supported that the country should resume its original name. That we also have a movement that campaigns for that, as well as promoting the local culture. And they have periodic demonstrations and rallies throughout the year where they protest on different corruption issues, etc. Similarly, in India, many diverse regions, states, languages, and cultural traditions. So, and we have a woman who took out a march and rally, just uplifting the dignity, protecting the dignity of women, their position in society, and the others, that was a clipping actually from a newspaper, a demonstration going on, often therefore promoting use of the local language, and developing the local economy. You know, in one part of India, you've maybe heard that many farmers have committed suicide, small-scale farmers committing suicide because the
Green Revolution. Was it after the Green Revolution or during?
Yeah, no, but just recently, in the last so many years, yes. So because still they get, because of the seeds from Monsanto and the fertilizers and et cetera, they're not able to manage economically. They lose all hope. And in the USA, mainly publications, seminars, advocacy work, publications. Roar he is a Norwegian, but he lives in America since a very long time. Who wrote the book? And Dome Structures is a conference and retreat center that we have there.
Reminds me a little bit of Waldorf, like Rudolf Steiner design of the dome roofs. It's beautiful.
This is a Rising Sun is a newsletter, more internal newsletter though, for the proudest women of North America. Okay. So if any of these
Are you not in
Once we
Thailand?
wanted to go into more. I'm sorry.
Is PROUT not in Thailand?
Thailand.
Yeah.
And there's a Dada like myself who's there,
Yes.
but we don't have any projects or activity
No.
going on right now. In Taiwan,
No,
yes, I was going to, also in Taiwan, yes, one of our members is also a teacher at one of the universities, and they've been training and promoting training students, university students, and promoting them to form cooperatives amongst themselves, and consumers cooperative, and also they helped some of the indigenous people in the local area also to form a crafts cooperative.
I'm meaning a small village called House of Joy. You know that?
Banurak.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
In
Okay.
Banu.
Yes. Okay. Because I'm presenting about PROUT this evening, but obviously I'm also a monk of Ananda Marga. It's called the movement.
Yes.
So the yoga and meditation teaching and organization.
They are working in this the same way you were.
Yes, with the women especially
Yeah,
in the village. Yeah. Have you been there?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
She's
Yeah.
the sister of my brother.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Passed away.
Mm.
He was very active. He helped us build the school.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know.
And my daughter is in another month in Delhi,
Uh-huh.
Saraswati.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So yes, I know a lot of this.
Okay, yes. They have a very large, we have, in that part of our movement, we have a lot of social service and village community development work going on all over the world. So what she's referring to, there's a very large children's home and school also in a border area of Thailand next to Myanmar. And most of the children that they take care of have crossed the border, or they are from Burmese families, but grew up in Thailand, but they don't have citizenship in Thailand. So.
Can I ask?
But she lived here in Iceland, and she was so busy in Iceland.
Uh-huh.
She,
The Norwegian?
yeah, the Norwegian.
Okay.
She was staying here 20 years ago.
Okay. Small world.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you for this, by the way. Yeah, it was very interesting. But I'm curious, being a huge proponent, kind of spokesperson for UBI,
Mm.
what is it in particular? What is it that you don't like, or don't like? Why this focus rather than? Do you think that it is a bad thing, the UBI, or? I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on it.
It's a very interesting topic because the general idea that we have is that it's good if everyone contributes something to society.
Mm-hmm.
And with the UBI system, in principle, there's no need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the research shows, surprisingly to many, that people actually become very creative and very engaged when they get it.
Yeah.
So it's, I have to admit that, but conceptually, we think that it has the possibility of, and actually I've seen in practice, and particularly in Scandinavian country, when I was in Europe in the 80s and spent most of my time in Scandinavia, and there are so many people at least in Sweden, particularly in Norway, maybe less in Finland, but that are capable of doing something, but very easily get supported by the state and don't have to do anything or get released from it, and it's generally not very good for them. And that's nothing to do with UBI directly, because that's just the way that the very liberal system of welfare support has been in the northern countries for so long with the social democratic tradition. But the concept we have at the base of it is just that it would be, that it's good and healthy and proper, that everyone who's capable, everyone who's physically and mentally healthy enough, should do something to contribute to the welfare of society. And like I said before, it might be helping children, helping elderly people, doing something good for the environment, not just having a job, a normal job.
So it's the same end, like, kind of target. It's just a different kind of way of getting there.
Surely.
Yeah.
Maybe it gives you more value also if you are contributing.
Absolutely.
Maybe it has to do something with that also.
Surely.
It can be that if you are contributing something that's on a voluntary basis, also. I think it's, my experience, it was like that just 40 years ago. Everywhere in Iceland, everybody helped each other. I was growing up, if somebody gets fish, like I'm born in Reykjavik, but even there, I live in a block, a big building, and if my mother gets extra fish, there were no refrigerators and so on, then we're not going to go to the neighbor and give him one fish or two. And we did all the time. I was I thought everybody did that. And I lived in Thailand for 1 year. And I lived in Scandinavia. People do that, even in Norway. I have been living many years in Norway. People do that. They call it dugnad. This is just, I think, just last 40 years, we have changed, especially in Europe, to being mono-thinking individuals, not like we live in society. Because in Norway, I think a lot of people help. It's very easy to get help. Something wrong. But it's easy to let the government give you some money if you don't have it. I think it's just beyond the problem.
It's also just the underlying shit. So how do you, because it also just has to do with, there's been a shift in ideology, obviously. This happened, when we're moving into this neoliberal capitalism model that we know today is a shift, complete shift in ideology. And our economic system is built on a very faulty ideology.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, if faulty maybe today, I guess it served its purpose to a certain extent, but it's maybe not going to be serving us very well into the future, especially when we're facing this ecological disaster ahead of us. So how do you propose that we shift again the ideological kind of roots of our economic model? Like, how does this happen? Does it happen gradually? Because I feel like it has to happen quite quickly.
It has to happen quickly, indeed.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, there was a slide I didn't share that's there. We have to work on many fronts at the same time. No? So, one is education, advocacy work. One is giving examples, creating examples of it in practice, even if it's a micro, project or a micro example of it. Raising consciousness in all different ways. Policy and advocacy, very much. There's a group in the U.S. right now, a national network of 400 or 500 activists and academicians. They're called the Economic Democracy Advocates. One of their mentors has a comment on the back cover of the book. They're having about 40 or 50 of them are doing a study circle now with this book and have adopted PROUT basically as their foundation and are using this basically like a textbook. And one of the gentlemen is a political economist and he's worked with European governments in the 70s as well, and he's commissioned even by the IMF to work on alternative economic visions. So they very much focus, part of their work is on policy advocacy. And our PROUT Research Institute, we have a department that moves more into that more and more as well. So that's one reason why we are trying to get this book into the hands of different people all around the world. That if we have people who are starting to develop new policy visions, and that's very much connected and important to the work you mentioned about having this part of your parliamentary work looking at the future.
Yeah.
So on all, a multi-pronged attack.
So how do you, I'm sorry, I have a few questions, but I'm wondering about like how you figure technological advance into PROUT, like when it comes to automation of work and so forth. And I noticed that you talked about work not necessarily being as we define it today. Work today is defined in a way that there's so much work in our society that is just hidden work that doesn't get no one gets paid for it, but it's still very important work. So how does that, how within this system that you've kind of drawn out or created in this book, how does work get defined and how does it get decided who gets paid? Like if it's not a UBI that just automatically gets paid to everyone, how do you decide the value of that work and who gets the money and how do you police the system? Like efterlit, what's the English word for efterlit?
Police kind of works.
No,
I think.
there's a better word for
Regulation.
Enforce?
Regulation.
No. Never mind.
But anyway, I understand what you mean.
Like,
Okay, it's a great...
Because our now, like our welfare system as it functions today, it has a huge back end around it of people who are looking into all of your personal details. Do you deserve this money or do you not?
It's
monitoring, yes.
Okay.
Like the whole monitoring behind the system. So I'm wondering like how this has been worked out within PROUT, the economy.
A few general comments first.
Yeah.
So a lot of aspects of PROUT are guiding principles and some really very detailed policies as well. I didn't go into much, but and how they're going to be applied and manifest is up to us and up to local people because it's going to vary again from place to place and from time to time. But there are certain defining characteristics or guiding principles that will help in that process. Secondly, that PROUT's very much an integral system. So it's not easy to isolate one part without considering how it fits in with the rest of the vision. So, for example, directly to the question you're asking, is in a decentralized, democratized economy, where most of the economic activity is done through cooperatives, the cooperative members and their management bodies will make very much a lot of those decisions. For example, so in principle, the main question you asked in the beginning is, we welcome and embrace technological innovation and rationalization and modernization, the use of the most modern, ecologically benevolent technologies. Okay, and they're going to become more and more well-designed and more harmonious with environmental conditions as time goes on. So, for example, and it's a simplistic example, but say that people are working 8 hours a day in the cooperative and they're earning a certain level, and they introduce a new technology that allows them to drop down to 4 hours a day, and their profitability remains the same, or maybe increases. Unlike a privately owned corporation, they can decide collectively and in a democratic way that everyone gets to work less and we still earn the same amount because now the machines are doing it for us. And of course, people will be encouraged to use their time for positive pursuits.
Yeah.
I mean, You have more time with family. You have more time to learn to play an instrument or a new language or travel somewhere or whatever it is, you know.
This kind of thing also pushes innovation. Like they've had some kind of a system, I believe, in Germany, where it's common that the boards of companies have a lot of worker representation, and I think Germany manufactures about 10% of the world's manufacturing. Usually, these manufacturing countries have very low wages, but and long working hours. But in Germany, there's pretty short working hours and high wages. So it seems like it's this kind of an environment fosters like the workers figuring out how to innovate the machines and how to design the processes so there's less work needed because they actually profit from doing so instead of just being fired, you know, when they're not needed.
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's just stagnating for technological advance. Also the fact when people are afraid of automation and technological advance, as it is in many places today, because they keep thinking, well, you know, we need to, you know, people need jobs, so it kind of stagnates the advance also.
One of the cynical views about UBI is it's being introduced so that people know at least people are going to have enough money to keep paying their rent and buying their food and all that, because people know that they're not going to
keep the GDP growing.
So so again, with a decentralized and democratized economic setup, it's not so much an issue.
No.
And in fact, it frees people's time for more creative and subtle pursuits. So, but under a private ownership model.
I'm wondering, how does PROUT tackle global cooperation? So, or like global responsibility. So if you get a community that is self-reliant, and say Iceland became self-reliant, but we still have Syria definitely not self-reliant, how does this theory factor in that
not every country has the resources to be self-reliant?
Yes. So if we, because it sounds a little bit like closing off. If you close off trade, then you close off a lot of communication, and there's a lot of interdependency.
Right. No closing off of trade. Real, true free trade is embraced, but it's considered that it should be done, you know, between countries of, okay, it doesn't address the issue that you're raising, but in principle, that it's best when it happens between areas of a parity, economic parity, the same level of development. And in fact, again, Scandinavia being a very good model, that when the self-reliance and at the level of parity is similar or matching, they can even merge together into a more unified, larger area. Okay, but then, of course, humanitarian assistance or intervention even is also embraced, is endorsed, but that would move over into the political arena.
So there would still be a governing body over a country or like a region that would be responsible for global communication and foreign.
Sure. Yes.
I mean,
there can be self. Excuse me.
No, you carry on.
I mean, there could be self-reliant economic zones, multiple zones within one country or nation state. It may also be that they become, over time, the country itself becomes a larger zone. That expansion into larger zones is part of the concept over time. But of course, the strengths of keeping it decentralized and self-reliant also to withstand any shocks to the system. Iceland's Reykjavik, particularly, maybe the whole country's economy, I hear, is booming right now. Why? Everyone,
tourism.
The people I've asked, tourism. Okay, what happens when the tourism stops for whatever reasons.
Disaster.
Yeah.
Pandemonium.
So it's obvious why self-reliance is important. But once it's achieved and it can be maintained, it can be expanded as well. Of course, Iceland's a bit unique in that it's distant and defined very much by the island's geography. But there's a concept. We didn't talk at all about the political concepts. There's a concept of a world government, but very much on a federation basis. That it could be like a federation of these self-reliant zones, that they could over time either replace, substitute what nation states are today. Many nation states are, of course, artificially carved out by colonial past and war and etc. So rather than what you could call natural nations of people throughout the world.
So it's like self-sufficient areas coming together voluntarily from a position of strength.
And there's a model of the government models of ensuring minority representation also in parliament.
I worry about because in Iceland we are because of our we're an island. It's so easy for us to close off the borders, and we do. So we're not, even though we are short on workers, and we have a lot of money, and we have a lot of everything to give. We're still not accepting refugees, and the Icelandic mindset is we are Icelanders, and this does not concern me. And I personally would like to see this turn around to be more part of a global. We are globally responsible for everybody. It doesn't matter where you're born or if you live in the same area. You're still human. So
we do accept some refugees.
It's also this government.
Proportionally more than a lot of these larger countries that are doing the wars.
I think we have 50. We have about. I think we get about 50 refugees per year. I think.
Yeah, proportionally, that's more than France and United States in the proportion to our population.
No, I don't think so. We actually do, and we're even not paying our humanitarian support funds like we have agreed to do. I mean, this country is a disgrace when it comes to human suffering that doesn't happen inside of this country.
Yeah, but that just has to do. That's the politics, you know.
That is the politics, but it's so. Well, that is the politics, and the politics is the people. And if the people have this view that no, we don't have to help anybody, so let's not. And I'm afraid if it weren't for like the iron fist of the.
But this is also part of. I feel that this is also part of the underlying ideology behind our system, right? Is what comes with this shift of ideology is this real focus on individualism above all else. And what's also come with it is in this increased consumerism, there's been a disconnect and people have a lack of purpose, right? So you have individualism, lack of purpose, and this kind of breakdown of society that you were talking about earlier, how it used to be a few decades ago when we were taking better care of each other, right? So we've come to a point where I think also just people, it's easier to disconnect from other human beings and see yourselves as separate from, rather than part of. And I think what you're trying to introduce, like the idea behind it, is that we're all a family, you know, rather than just individuals somehow pushed together into a society. I think that this could also, like, if we change our economy and if we change how our society functions, then we could also change, like, we could increase empathy, for one. Love for each other.
The philosophical basis, you can say, is something that we call neo-humanism, which is an embracing of all, not only all people, not all the humans, but all of life. So that concept, ecological concept of the web of life, that we're part of that, you know. And there's another sort of motto that we have that says it's regional in application but universal in approach, so that what's good for this area is good for all areas, and we recognize and understand that. So there's a connection on that level. So yeah, it's definitely promoting that values base, as I said in the beginning.
But it's also like when people are struggling, as our current economy does, with inequality growing, and you have people who are struggling, like here in Iceland, I mean, it's not on the same scale as if you go to India or Africa, parts of Asia, but here we still have inequality in a way that there are people who are working full-time jobs and they're still struggling to make ends meet. They don't have enough time to spend with their children and their families and friends and doing things that truly fulfill them in their life. They don't even have time to think about those things. So when you have that, there's very little capacity to look forward, and there's very little empathy for other human beings because you're in a place of scarcity. So I think if we're moving towards a society where we're going towards abundance, really, which is kind of what you're talking about in PROUT, we could be moving towards abundance if we become self-sufficient, when that is abundance. That empathy grows, and all of this will change also. I'm interested to read the book, but the thing that worries me from the little part that I've heard you speak about is the idea, and I think this is very instilled in all of us pirates, is the freedom of the individual to choose what they do, really. So the idea of somehow we'd always move towards incentivizing rather than like forcing people to partake in something that they don't want to partake in.
There's no sense of coercion here. No. It's a market economy still.
It is, yeah.
So, but only that the limitation would be on accumulation of wealth.
Exactly.
And that's based on the simple idea that if somebody has too much, others don't have enough. So we recognize all forms of wealth. So whether it's physical and material, financial, or the inner assets we have of our minds and spirits. So those are limitless, and we can get as much of it as we can without anyone else feeling any problem. But on the physical level, whether it's resources or money or whatever, there's limitations.
I've got concerns about, the ideology is really...
Sorry?
The ideology is really kind of impressive, but how to kind of implement it, because ideas like nationalism and capitalism, I don't see it. I don't see people in power want to, especially in Iceland, people in power have money as well. So it's like this
everywhere.
Sure. Control of power. So they're not gonna,
give it away.
They're not gonna come and listen to this kind of activity. But what's his kind of approach to implementing this?
Approach to implement.
Yeah.
Well, again.
How are you gonna make it?
Yeah. Again, as I mentioned, it has to be multi-pronged. There's education and advocacy, consciousness raising. There's growing movements. People's movements and social movements, and I think ultimately that's it. And there's bringing pressures to bear through such movements, whether they be outright electoral politics or I think more mass social movements. We've seen indications of the potential for things. Look, for how they can be easily written off, perhaps, but there's very significant in the Western developed world what happened with Bernie Sanders in America and what the Labour Party recently did in the UK. They were significant in mobilizing large numbers of people and particularly young people. And in both cases, the sentiment was, the Labour Party manifesto summed it up beautifully. It said, for the many, not the few. And Bernie Sanders continuously talked about the 99% or whatever. So it ignited tremendous force. Okay, it still came up against the powers that be, sure, but that's the nature of activism. You just have to have that determination and keep going and keep going, and there'll be a critical mass achieved. But what's really important also is two things, I think: the vision and the values. Because we've seen revolutions come and fail. We've seen people who the world admired, and then the reputation. I mean, even look what happens now with the Rohingya people in Myanmar and the reputation of Aung San Suu Kyi. What a disappointment. So the need to work on ourselves, to purify our minds and hearts, to really become emboldened and ethical and upright and leaders, and at the same time ignite the people with the sentiments and the force that will mobilize them for change. And there have been PROUT's theory. The historical theory, what we call the social cycle, addresses the concept of revolution and talks about the phenomenon of revolution and counter-revolutions and all of this. So it's considered inevitable if what's going on in the world today continues the way it is, in one form or another, and it will be different again in somewhere like Iceland than in somewhere like Zimbabwe, because of the cultural and social conditions and everything else, how it manifests. But something that breaks the mold, that creates a significant change.
It always comforts me to think that democracy and women's rights and so many of these things that we think of as being just absolutely normal today, were at some point thought to be utopian ideals that would never come to being. So,
I think we are in the wrong direction. I'm a teacher, and I see that our children, young ones, who are struggling with, they have learned they are special, they are individual, and they have rights, but we need to teach them that everybody is important, not just them, and everybody has rights, and everybody is needed for the work. It's my everyday struggling to tell them everybody is important, everybody has rights. We have to love everybody, not just somebody, this one and this one, everybody. And I think we need to change our mind, change our thinking.
Yeah.
And I think individualism is. We are on a cliff, hanging. I think this is. If we continue in this way, we get just trouble.
Yeah. And we put. So P.R. Sarkar was the founder of PROUT, but also the spiritual guide for the Anandamarga movement. He put tremendous importance on early childhood education, and we've opened many schools. So there's one, Sailokot, here in Reykjavik is our school.
They know it. They have the.
I've been there. I'm helping.
Yeah. Okay. And it's called, as I mentioned, the philosophical base is called neo-humanism, and it's called neo-humanist education. So it's very much about inculcating those values in the young minds. And we found many children who have grown into adults around the world who went through these schools. We have schools all over the world. They have a whole different outlook on life than so many of their peers that didn't have that kind of early molding.
Yeah. I think that this is. I think people have misunderstood this word, individualism. I think they have used it in the wrong direction, and we are in big trouble everywhere in the world.
Yes.
But every individual is important, and of course we have to. Our speech have to be listened to. Everybody have to listen to us. I'm not. It's a very thin line between selfishness and individualism and ruin. I think this is a problem. I think that in the Pirate Party, I'm in this party, but this is the one thing I don't like.
Is what? The individualism?
Yeah.
But we don't really have that.
You have it, okay, but as I listened many times here, come here many times, but yeah, I think we need to think in different ways.
I think society is really based on individualism. I think even more than in the US. There's a study actually from this university that says I think that society is more individualistic than the US.
Yes.
The US is like the token of individualism, I think, but we're still beating them.
I think we are, because I lived in Norway. I came from Norway 1 year ago, and I lived in Sweden, Denmark, Thailand, and Czechia. And I see there is, here we are like crazy. I don't feel this in Norway, for example. They are nuts.
Individualism is very good though compared to like dogmatic religion or materialist like communism, which doesn't respect the individual at all. So individualism is getting close to something.
There's a balance in everything.
Yeah,
balance
when
in everything.
everybody else, then that's not okay.
Yeah.
And
So
there's
it's,
social individualism and economic individualism.
Right.
I mean,
Sure.
there's some parts of liberal or libertarian theory that I actually like. Like everybody had just the human being, like a person is defined as an autonomous being. So I cannot be made to do anything.
Exactly.
That does not give me the right to do upon others what they don't want me to do, but I cannot be made to do anything. Nobody owns me. I am not a farm animal. I am autonomous in my life. And
free.
I think this is one of the values I hold very dearly.
Me too.
And I love it. But socially, I would like to see more cooperation. And I freely give of myself and of my time. And
Yeah, and fortunately, there's, I mean, both in the field of education, especially in the field of education, and also in general, in human relations and psychology, I mean, there's tremendously positive work that's going. I mean, you know, they talk now that we're hardwired to cooperate rather than to compete. I mean, just amazing research and amazing application of the research, all kinds of trainings and educational initiatives and things. So there's, if you go into it, there's a lot there. So rather than anyone complaining, rather we should train ourselves to be able to implement those things better and better, because there's a wealth of tools available nowadays. So, you know.
It's just really when you take the individual out of the whole, you know, that's when it becomes a problem. Like, because if we're all individuals, yes, and that's a great thing, but we're also part of the whole. And that's the part that gets forgotten so many times in our modern societies, and people become kind of sequestered and isolated and miserable. That's why we have a minister of loneliness in the UK. It's crazy.
Minister of Loneliness.
Yeah, minister of loneliness.
Really?
Is it?
I haven't heard that before.
Yeah,
in the UK, I mean, it's just a recent thing.
Yeah, they just created this new ministry.
This the minister that was killed, you know, she
Joe
had been
Cox.
working for you know, immigrants, and she had started this, and then they created it now. And they found out that 1 of every 7, you know, in the UK suffers from loneliness. 1 of
And that's at that point, like, we have to ask ourselves when these things are coming up, and the amount of the people that are just being broken in society and going on disability because of mental illness, you have to ask yourself, maybe something's wrong with our society, you know? Maybe we have to stop trying to put all of the people and try to make them fit into society, and maybe we should start molding society so that's actually serving the people. You know, it's just a backwards way of doing things. Whatever it is we're doing now, it isn't working anymore, so we need to change it.
somebody just took a spreadsheet and said, if people were like this,
Yeah.
then this would maximize profits. And then they tried to upload people into the spreadsheet, which is not possible.
I think it's instructive to use like biological analogies, like cells in a human body. They have a membrane to protect themselves, but the membrane has it communicates and it gets nutrients and so on from the intercellular fluid. In a similar way, countries also have membrane. Cancerous cells, they grow and they don't respect the membranes.
No, they just grow their own way.
So I think in respect to, like, for example,
they get isolated and then they want to try to get other cells to come with them.
Yeah.
So that they can grow.
But I think, for example, in regards to like the migrant worker type thing or the refugee thing, there is a danger. There's wars and so on. It's not good for the working people to have to compete always internationally for the lowest wages. This will create something different when there are capitalists that invest very heavily in weapons and also promote this open borders ideology also. Yeah, but it's related.
But I have to say thank you and take my daughter home and put her to bed. Did they just take a bunch of cookies in there?
Yeah,
definitely.
That's macro or microeconomics.
Yeah, we have very much market connection here in this.
Yeah. You said your doctor is in Copenhagen.
Yeah, no, she lives in Odense, but she's in another market in Denmark.
What's her name?
Sarah Santipa. Sarah. Yeah, she was married there, and she and her husband. I'm not sure what his name is in Sanskrit. And her daughter was in Cyberpunk.
The price is different than what
And
she
then-
had.
And
$1,500.
I was working in
This one's $2,000.
Vanundra for some days, helping them. Vanundra.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
In Thailand, yeah.
Yeah.
Just helping in some problem. I was just visiting her because I knew her from before.
Oops.
And she said, welcome.
Thank you so very much for the opportunity.
This is my card.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Já, og ég slíta. Ok, ég slít þessum hundi það. Takk fyrir. Já, I forgot that I was supposed to end the meeting. Thank you very much. Jú, það er
Frábært. Dara, you can look at yourself later.
Yeah.